Hello there tonight. We are going to slip quietly into the hidden corridors of history. Imagine it's late, maybe midnight. The house is still. The fan hums softly in the corner. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once and then fades into the hush of night. Tonight's story isn't about wars or kings or conquests. It's about women. Women who never asked to be born into royalty, into bloodlines, twisted like knots, bound by duty, trapped by expectations, and ultimately undone by the very families who claimed to love them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. Let's begin with a simple truth. Bloodlines have always mattered to kings and queens more than love, more than happiness, more than sanity. And so for centuries, the noble families of Europe married their cousins, their nieces, their uncles, their siblings. They did this because the blood must stay pure, because the land must stay in the family, because tradition said so. And who suffered most from this endless, suffocating loop of royal marriages? It wasn't the kings. Not really. It was the women. Their bodies bore the price. Their minds frayed beneath the weight of obligation. Their children were born frail, sickly, doomed from their very first breath. And so tonight, we're going to walk slowly and softly through a history of these women, not to mock them, not to sensationalize them, but to remember them, these lost daughters of kings and empires. Let's start by thinking about why inbreeding happened at all. Imagine you're a king in medieval Europe. You rule a patch of land no bigger than a modern shopping mall. But to you, it's everything. And your neighbor, who is also your cousin, of course, rules another patch of dirt you desperately want for your son. Marriage is the solution. Marry your daughter to your cousin's son. Marry your niece to your brother. Close the loop. Keep the power. Keep the blood clean. But clean is the wrong word, isn't it? Clean implies health, strength, clarity. The truth is, over generations, this obsession with blood created families where sickness bred sickness, where children were born with jaws they couldn't close, with minds that couldn't hold on to reality, with hearts too weak to beat past childhood. And yet, they kept doing it. Because tradition is stronger than reason. Because fear of losing power is stronger than fear of birth defects. Because appearances, the facade of unity, of strength, of continuity, mattered more than the secret rot inside. It's almost funny in a dark way. These kings and queens, these dukes and counts, they thought they were building dynasties of marble and iron, but what they built were glass palaces held together by crumbling bones. For women, this reality was inescapable. A prince could refuse a match run off with a mistress or simply disappear to war. A princess could not. She was the marriage. She was the contract. Her body was the vessel through which these fragile lines continued, or didn't. And if she failed, if her children died, if her mind broke, if her health collapsed, it was her shame to bear never the system's fault. This is the shadow beneath the glittering portraits, the jeweled crowns, the grand weddings. Beneath every royal bride smiling for a painting was a young woman who understood often too late what had been done to her and what she was expected to do in turn. And it's not just Europe. You'll see tonight that this pattern, repeated from Spain to Portugal to Greece to Austria to Egypt, and even to quiet corners of modern America and Australia, it wasn't always crowned heads. Sometimes it was poor families, isolated, uneducated, trapped in cycles of secrecy and shame. But always, it was women who paid the price first. Tonight, I want you to listen not with judgment, but with a kind of sleepy compassion. Imagine these women as your neighbor, your sister, your ancestor. They didn't choose this. Most of them didn't even understand it until it was too late. They were born into houses already poisoned by tradition. They were offered up to marriages decided long before they were old enough to understand what marriage meant. Some of them became queens. Some of them became mothers. Some of them became nothing at all, forgotten before their names could fade from the family tree. And yet, through all of this, there's a strange resilience. Even in the most tangled, broken families, life continued. Sometimes short, sometimes tragic, but always stubbornly continuing. There's something oddly comforting in that. So as we drift through these stories, let the details settle gently. No need to hold on to the names too tightly. Let the timelines blur a little. This isn't a history lecture, it's a bedtime story in its own quiet, unsettling way. We'll move slowly, one woman at a time. Each of them has something to tell us about the cost of power, the price of bloodlines, the quiet strength of survival. And remember, this isn't about pity, it's about understanding. It's about acknowledging the weight some people carried so we don't forget how heavy it truly was. Are you comfortable? Are your eyes growing heavier? Good. That's exactly how it should be. Let's begin with Isabella II, a queen born into a family tree so tangled it looped back on itself. A girl born to be a pawn, married off before she could grow up, forced to bear children not for love, but for lineage. Isabella II of Spain never had a choice. Not in where she was born, not in whom she married, and certainly not in how history would remember her. Born into a family tree so tangled with itself it barely resembled a tree at all. Isabella was destined from the start to live a life dictated by others, by tradition, by politics, by men who cared far more about bloodlines than happiness. Let's settle into her story. Slow down, relax. There's no rush. We're moving through time, and time always moves slowly when we tell these kinds of stories. Isabella was born in 1830 to Ferdinand VII of Spain and Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. Now, you don't need to memorize the names. Just know this: her parents were uncle and niece. That's right. Her father was her mother's uncle. It's a connection so strange, so close, so utterly normalized in royal circles that nobody even blinked an eye. Not back then. From the very moment Isabella entered the world, expectations pressed down on her like the heavy velvet curtains in the palace. Spain needed an heir. Spain needed continuity. It didn't particularly matter that she was a girl. A boy would have been better, yes, but in the absence of a male heir, a girl would have to do. And so, with a sigh of relief disguised as a celebration, Isabella became heir to a troubled, fractured throne. Her health was delicate, as was her younger sister's. The doctors whispered about nerves, about female weaknesses, but history whispers something else entirely: inbreeding. The repeated folding of the family tree upon itself left Isabella and her sister fragile, vulnerable from the start. By the time Isabella was 16, her fate had been sealed not by her own choices, but by her advisors, by the expectations of Europe's tangled royal families. She was married off to her double second cousin, Francis, Duke of Cadiz. double second cousin. That means they shared great-grandparents on both sides of the family. It was less a marriage and more a tightening of the noose around their already choking bloodlines. Francis, by all accounts, was not interested in women. Historians whisper it gently. Gossip at the time shouted it loudly. Francis preferred the company of men, and Isabella knew this. It wasn't a marriage built on affection or even mutual respect. It was built on necessity, on tradition, on the desperate need to produce heirs, no matter how those heirs were conceived. The marriage was unhappy. Of course it was. How could it be otherwise? Isabella was young, isolated, increasingly paranoid. She was forced into the arms of a man who didn't want her, and she bore the brunt of public scrutiny when her children began arriving under suspicious circumstances. 11 pregnancies. Only 5 children survived infancy. The others, stillbirths, infant deaths, miscarriages were quietly mourned, if at all. Inbreeding doesn't just weaken the mind, it weakens the body, too. Fragile children born to fragile parents, doomed before their first breath. And here's where things turn from tragic to quietly absurd. Of the 5 surviving children, none were believed to be fathered by her husband. The names floated through court gossip like smoke: a guard, a priest, a diplomat, a stable boy. Who fathered whom mattered less than the fact that children existed to continue the illusion of continuity. Spain needed heirs. Isabella provided them by whatever means necessary. Imagine, just for a moment, being that girl, young, frightened, married to a man who barely looked at you, surrounded by courtiers who gossiped about you, who laughed behind their fans, at the parade of children who looked nothing like your husband. And yet, you were expected to smile, to wave, to carry the weight of a crumbling monarchy on your already thin shoulders. Isabella's reign was marked by instability. Civil unrest brewed beneath the surface of Spain like a slow boiling storm. Her marriage was a farce. Her court was divided. Her mental health, fragile from the start, began to unravel beneath the strain. She turned to religion, to superstition, to desperate rituals and prayers to hold on to what little control she had left. By 1868, it was all over. A revolution swept through Spain, and Isabella was forced to abdicate. She fled to France, where she lived out her days in exile, watching from a distance as the throne she'd fought so hard to hold on to passed into other hands. She died in 1904, largely forgotten, her life reduced to footnotes and scandals in history books. But tonight, let's not forget her. Let's see her not as the failed queen or the weak woman history often paints her to be, but as a girl, born into an impossible situation. A girl trapped by decisions made generations before she ever took her first breath. A woman who carried the weight of a dynasty on her back while the world laughed at her pain. Because here's the truth that history rarely says aloud: Isabella didn't fail. The system failed her. The traditions, the expectations, the bloodlines so tangled they strangled the life from her children. These were the true culprits. Isabella was just the one left holding the pieces. As you drift deeper into sleep, think of her. A woman alone in a foreign land far from home, her children scattered, her crown gone. Think of the quiet strength it must have taken to simply survive. To keep moving forward when everything around you has crumbled. History forgets women like Isabella, but tonight you won't. Now your breathing has slowed, your eyes heavier than before. That's good. That's the point. When you're ready, We'll move on to Mary Louise, another young woman traded like a pawn, her body carrying the burden of empires, her life shaped by choices never truly her own. Mary Louise of Austria was born into a world where her worth was measured in bloodlines and wombs. She wasn't the first girl to be born into this trap, and she certainly wasn't the last. But her story reminds us just how little choice these royal women had over their own lives. By the time Mary Louise entered the world in 1791, her family had already been playing the inbreeding game for generations. Marrying cousins wasn't just tradition in the House of Habsburg, it was practically policy. The Habsburgs, like so many European dynasties, believed fiercely in keeping bloodlines pure. They married within their own circles so often that by the time Mary Louise was born, her family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled knot. To understand Mary Louise's life, you have to understand what she represented, not a person, but a political strategy. She was the eldest of 12 children, though only 7 would survive past childhood. A tragic but unsurprising number given how interwoven the family lines were. While most people have 8 great-grandparents, Mary Louise had just 4. Imagine the same handful of names appearing over and over again in your family history, like a song stuck on repeat. She was born into the Austrian Empire, a place where titles meant everything and women meant little, except as vessels for heirs. Her father was Emperor Francis II, and her mother was Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily. Yes, that's right. Another marriage between cousins, another attempt to tighten the noose of noble blood. From the moment Mary Louise opened her eyes, her future was no secret. She would be married off to someone strategic, someone politically convenient, and she would produce sons. That was her purpose. But plans don't always unfold as expected. Europe was changing. A little man from Corsica was rising to power, tearing through old monarchies like paper. Napoleon Bonaparte. He didn't come from royal blood. He didn't respect old traditions, but he understood the power of marriage. By 1810, Mary Louise found herself caught in the jaws of history. Napoleon had divorced his first wife, Josephine, because she couldn't give him a son. He wanted legitimacy now. He wanted an heir and a connection to one of Europe's oldest and most prestigious houses. Austria was nervous. Better to send a daughter than face another war. And so Mary Louise was offered up like a diplomatic olive branch. Imagine being just 18, your life uprooted overnight. You're shipped off to marry a man you've never met, a man twice your age, a man who is the sworn enemy of your father's empire. You don't love him. You don't even know him. But you smile, you wave, you wear the dress because that's what's expected. Mary Louise became Empress of the French in name, but she was never truly French. She was an Austrian pawn living in a gilded Parisian cage. Napoleon wanted a son, and soon she gave him one. Napoleon II, the King of Rome, the child meant to secure the future of an empire. For a brief moment, Mary Louise was a mother, an empress, a symbol of peace between old Europe and the new order. But empires built on war rarely last. Napoleon fell from power, exiled to Elba, then to St. Helena. Mary Louise did not follow him. Why would she? Their marriage was one of convenience, not love. When he lost his throne, she lost any reason to stay. Instead, she returned to Austria, not as a princess this time, but as a duchess in her own right. Her father granted her the Duchy of Parma, a quiet little corner of Italy, where she could finally live without the crushing weight of court expectations. There, for the first time, Mary Louise tasted something like freedom. She married again this time for something resembling affection. Her second husband wasn't a prince or a king, but a man she actually seemed to care for, Count Adam Albert von Nyberg. With him, she had more children, free from the suffocating glare of royal courts. These children weren't political tools. They were hers, simply and quietly hers. But the ghosts of her past never quite left her. Mary Louise's son by Napoleon remained a tragic figure, a boy trapped between empires, between worlds, between expectations he could never meet. He died young, never ruling anything, his title hollow. A fitting end for a child born of such calculated ambition. Mary Louise's life reminds us of something important. Not every queen, not every duchess wanted the life she was given. Sometimes survival meant adaptation. Sometimes happiness meant carving out a small corner of peace in a world that only valued you for your bloodline. Her story isn't filled with drama or scandal. It's quieter than Isabella II's, less tragic on the surface. But beneath that quiet, there's a lesson about resilience, about how a woman raised to serve dynasties found a way in the end to serve herself. As you drift deeper, now let Mary Louise's story settle gently in your thoughts. Imagine her not in a grand palace or surrounded by scheming courtiers, but in a sunlit garden in Parma, her children playing her heart at ease. Not a pawn anymore, not a prize, but simply a woman who survived. Tonight we remember her not as the Empress of the French, but as Mary Louise, a girl born into a losing game who found eventually a way to win quietly. Your breathing is slower now, your thoughts softer around the edges. Good. That's how we want it. When you're ready, we'll visit someone far from the glittering courts of Europe, Lauren Whitaker, a woman born not into royalty, but into something even more haunting, a modern echo of the same old story. Lauren Whitaker's story feels like something pulled from the dusty corners of an old history book, but it isn't. This isn't the story of medieval queens or forgotten duchesses. This is modern. This is America. This is now. And that, perhaps, is what makes it harder to look away. Not all tales of inbreeding come from palaces or marble halls. Some come from the hills, from poverty, from isolation, from generations of people who became so cut off from the world outside that their family trees stopped branching and simply folded back on themselves. The Whitaker family became a whispered legend long before cameras ever captured their lives. They lived in the Appalachian Mountains, tucked away in the hills of West Virginia, where the roads are narrow, the towns are small, and secrets have room to fester. Locals knew of them. They told stories about the strange family in the woods, how they kept to themselves, how their speech was garbled, how they seemed somehow frozen in time, untouched by the modern world. Lauren Whitaker was born into this, into isolation, into a lineage already frayed and fragile from decades, perhaps generations of inbreeding. You won't find her name on any royal scroll or beside any crown jewel, but the echoes of history are clear. This is what happens when bloodlines tighten too far, when families stop looking outward and turn ever inward. Her family didn't have titles or kingdoms. They had a crumbling house at the end of a dirt road, chickens in the yard, and a reputation that hung over them like fog. Lauren wasn't famous in the way Isabella or Mary Louise were. She was known in whispers, in pointed glances, in rumors swapped between neighbors over fences. In time, cameras found the Whitakers. Documentaries were made. The world watched, half with pity, half with horrified fascination. Loren became the face of a tragedy too real to ignore the human cost of isolation, the visible scars of choices made long ago and repeated again and again. Her son Timmy would become even more infamous. If Loren was a cautionary tale, Timmy became a living artifact. His features, his speech, his mannerisms shaped not just by upbringing, but by the slow, inevitable erosion of genetics over time. Medical experts could explain it in cold clinical terms: recessive genes meeting over and over, doubling down on mutations, eroding cognition, warping physiology. But no medical textbook could capture the loneliness, the quiet devastation of a life spent this way. Still, it's too easy to look at the Whitakers and think of them as something other, as something to gawk at. The truth is more complicated. These are people. They laugh. They cry. They love their families. They live their lives with a simplicity that in some ways shields them from the judgment of the outside world. Loren's story then isn't about blame. It's not about shame. It's about what happens when people slip through the cracks, when poverty isolates, when education fails, when communities turn a blind eye and say, that's just how they are. There's a tendency to romanticize rural life, to imagine it as simple, pure, untouched by the ugliness of modernity. But isolation can breed more than peace. It can breed silence, secrets, cycles that repeat not out of malice, but out of habit, out of lack, out of the absence of any other choice. Imagine being Loren, growing up in a world so small it barely stretched beyond your front porch. Speaking a language no outsider understands, not because it's foreign, but because years of genetic decline have muddied the words, blurred the edges of comprehension. Imagine looking in the mirror and seeing the echoes of your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents staring back not as a metaphor, but in the very structure of your face, the tilt of your jaw, the shape of your hands. There is a sadness to Loren's story, yes, but there is also resilience. She raised her son. She lived her life. She existed quietly in defiance of a world that would rather not look too closely. And isn't that survival in its own way? Not grand, not noble, but steady, human. The Whitakers didn't choose this. Loren didn't wake up one morning and decide to carry the weight of history's mistakes. She inherited them. Just as queens once inherited crowns, Loren inherited silence, repetition, isolation. And like those queens, she endured. When we think of inbreeding, it's easy to confine it to dusty portraits and royal scandals. But Loren reminds us, this isn't history. This is reality. This is now. The same forces that twisted royal bloodlines into knots, pride, fear, tradition, ignorance, still twist in smaller, quieter places. And there's something hauntingly universal about that, about how the human desire to belong, to stay close, to keep family near, can sometimes curdle into something tragic. About how the walls we build around ourselves to keep the world out can become cages before we realize we've locked the door. As you rest, now let Loren's story settle somewhere soft in your mind. Not as a freak show, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder that compassion matters, that understanding matters, that history isn't always written in gold ink on parchment. Sometimes it's written in dirt roads and empty porches and quiet, resilient lives. And tomorrow, when you see someone you don't understand, someone who seems other, remember Loren. Remember that behind every face, however strange to us, is a life lived with hopes and hurts not so different from our own. Your breathing is slower now. The edges of the world feel softer. That's good. That's exactly how this is meant to be. When you're ready, we'll leave the hills of West Virginia and return to the marble halls of Europe where madness was born, not from isolation, but from generations of royal insistence that blood must remain pure. Maria the Vine of Portugal was born into a gilded world, already cracking beneath the weight of its own traditions. Hers was a family where power mattered more than love, where bloodlines mattered more than sanity, and where duty meant marrying your own uncle, if that's what the crown required. If Isabella's story felt tragic and Lauren's felt quietly modern, Maria's life is something stranger, a collision of faith madness and the cruel expectations of royal blood. Tonight, we linger in her story a little longer, because hers shows us how even queens can't escape the ghosts that live inside their veins. Maria was born in 1734 to King Joseph I of Portugal and Maria Ana Victoria of Spain. This was no fairy tale union. Her parents were cousins, part of a long tradition of Iberian royals, marrying within their own bloodlines to keep thrones secure. Spain and Portugal had danced this dance for centuries, swapping daughters and nephews like chess pieces across the marriage board. By the time Maria arrived, she was already tangled in that ancient web. Her mind, her body, her future were all written long before she spoke her first words. She was born to be queen, not because she wanted it, not because she was suited to it, but because there was simply no one else. When Maria was 25, unmarried and heir to the Portuguese throne, her family panicked. A woman alone on the throne, dangerous. A woman without heirs, unthinkable. So they reached for the nearest solution. They married her to her uncle, her father's brother, Pedro III of Portugal. Let that sink in. Not a distant cousin, not some fourth-degree relation. Her father's brother, her own uncle, a man she had grown up calling Tio, a man whose blood already ran thick in her veins. But this was royal blood, and royal blood has its own rules. Love was irrelevant. Happiness, a luxury. Duty was everything. The marriage served its purpose in the most clinical sense. Maria had children, 8 in fact, but half of them didn't survive to adulthood. Inbreeding's shadow lingered quiet but cruel. Those who did live carried the weight of fragile bodies and fragile minds. Maria's bloodline was thinning, unraveling beneath the strain of too much closeness, too many repeated names on the family tree. Still, Maria ruled. When her father died in 1777, she became the first undisputed queen, regnant of Portugal. For a time, things seemed stable. She was devoutly religious, almost painfully so. Faith became her refuge, her armor against the pressures of rule. She believed in divine right, in the sacred duty of monarchy. But faith, like blood, can curdle when pressed too hard. Slowly, signs of instability crept in. Whispers about her behavior grew louder. Mood swings, fits of weeping, terrifying rages, religious ecstasies that blurred into mania. Historians debate the causes. Was it genetic madness passed down from generations of cousin marriages? Was it the unbearable pressure of queenship? Was it grief after losing her husband and children? The answer likely is all of the above. Maria's descent into madness wasn't sudden. It unraveled like a thread pulled loose. By 1786, after her husband's death, she could no longer function as queen. Doctors prescribed treatments that now sound like torture bleedings, ice baths, isolation. Nothing worked. Her mind was slipping, and with it, the governance of Portugal. By 1792, her son João had to take over as regent. Maria, once called Maria the Pious, became Maria the Mad. They hid her away out of sight, as royals often did with their inconvenient truths. Her illness was an embarrassment, a stain on the image of royal perfection. And yet, it was the inevitable result of the very traditions that had placed her on the throne. Think of her now, in those final years, not in a palace, but in a shadowed room, curtains drawn, voices hushed. A woman who had once ruled an empire, reduced to muttering prayers to a god she feared and loved in equal measure. A woman who had given everything her blood demanded, only to lose herself in the end. Maria died in 1816. She had spent nearly half her life hidden from the world. Portugal remembered her as mad, as tragic, as proof that divine right and bloodlines were no match for the quiet cruelty of mental illness. But tonight, as you rest, let's remember her differently. Let's see Maria not as a cautionary tale, but as a human being trapped in a system she never chose. A woman born into a prison of expectations, carrying the weight of centuries on shoulders too fragile to bear it. Her story isn't unique. Across Europe, across centuries, women like Maria lived and broke beneath the same invisible burdens. But tonight, we pause here. We acknowledge her suffering. We soften our judgment. We let compassion settle, where history so often leaves ridicule. As your breathing grows slower, your thoughts softer, imagine Maria as she might have wanted to be remembered, not as a mad queen, not as a footnote in royal history, but as a woman who tried, who endured, who carried more than anyone ever should. When you're ready, we'll move on to another woman bound by blood and duty. Another Mary Louise. Another story of closeness, masquerading as love of marriages, written in ink long before hearts were consulted. Sleep gently now. Mary Louise Elizabeth of Orleans didn't have a choice either. That's a common thread, isn't it? None of these women had choices. Not real ones. Not the kind that mattered. They were born into names, into bloodlines, into marriages signed in ink long before they even learned how to read. Mary Louise's story isn't famous. You won't see her name in many history books outside of Europe. But her life was shaped by the same cold forces that shaped the lives of Isabella Maria and so many others before her bloodline's duty and the endless loop of cousin, marrying cousin generation after generation. She was born in 1662 into the tangled mess of French and Spanish royalty. Her father, Philippe the Duke of Orleans, was the younger brother of the famously extravagant King Louis XIV of France. Her mother, Henrietta of England, the daughter of England's Charles III. So from birth, Mary Louise was strung between two great nations, two great families, and a web of expectations so tight it might as well have been iron chains. But here's the thing about royal families: love, affection, compatibility, none of that matters. What matters is alliances. What matters is keeping land and titles exactly where they need to be. And so, despite a childhood spent among the glittering halls of Versailles, despite the opulence and pageantry, Mary Louise's future was grimly predictable. Her father married her off to Charles II of Spain. Yes, that Charles II. The one history remembers for his deformities, his vacant stare, his inability to rule or even speak clearly. The Habsburg curse. Years upon years of uncle marrying niece, cousin marrying cousin, all in the name of keeping power contained, had culminated in Charles. His jaw couldn't close properly, his tongue barely worked, his body was frail, his mind even frailer, and Mary Louise was sent to marry him, a bright, lively French princess. shipped off like cargo to a court shrouded in superstition and decay and whispers of curses and madness. Her job to produce an heir, to heal somehow the genetic rot festering in Spain's royal blood. Of course she couldn't. No one could. Charles wasn't capable of fathering children. Historians debate whether he even understood what marriage was in the first place. Mary Louise tried. She wrote letters home, filled with desperation, loneliness, longing for the warmth and laughter of France. In Spain, the court was cold. The people were suspicious. Her husband was a ghost of a man. There's a particular cruelty in her story that feels sharper than others. She wasn't just trapped in a loveless marriage. She was trapped in a decaying empire, in a family line, unraveling before her very eyes, while everyone around her waited, watched, and whispered about her womb. Every month without a child was a failure stamped on her body. Every miscarriage, and there were rumored to be several, was another nail in the coffin of her reputation. Her mental health unsurprisingly suffered. Reports from the time describe her as melancholic, prone to tears wasting away in her chambers. And who could blame her alone in a foreign land, married to a man who barely spoke, surrounded by courtiers who blamed her for things beyond her control? They said she didn't try hard enough. They said she was cursed. They said she was barren. She wasn't the only one suffering. Spain was crumbling. The Habsburg line was dying, and yet the traditions continued. Blame the woman, silence her pain, demand more heirs, more blood, more bodies to feed the throne. Mary Louise died young, just 26. Some said it was a broken heart. Some said it was poison. The truth is probably simpler and sadder. Depression, isolation, and the slow erosion of a body and soul, denied any joy, any purpose beyond reproduction. Her death did nothing to stop the decline. Charles remarried again in hopes of an heir, again in vain. He died childless. The Spanish Habsburg line died with him, swallowed by the very obsession with bloodlines that had created him. And yet, when we think of Mary Louise, let's not think of her as a failure. Let's think of her as a woman born into a trap centuries in the making. A woman who deserved laughter, companionship, love. A woman whose story reminds us that royalty was often just another kind of prison, gilded though it might be. There's something haunting about her letters. She wrote to her family, to friends, begging for news, for warmth, for connection. Imagine that a princess, a queen, surrounded by servants and riches, yet starving for a kind word, a familiar face, someone who remembered who she was beneath the titles. And isn't that a kind of universal loneliness? Strip away the crowns, the jewels, the palaces, and what's left is a young woman far from home, isolated, unheard, unseen. That's not a royal tragedy. That's a human one. As you relax now, think of her not in a dark Spanish palace, not in silks and jewels, but in the gardens of Versailles, where she laughed as a child. Think of her smiling, free for a moment, before the weight of expectation settled on her shoulders. Let that be how we remember her tonight. Your breathing is softer now, your mind quieter. That's good. That's what stories like this are for. When you're ready, we'll move from the sad halls of Spain to the quieter tragedy of Greece, where yet another princess found herself bound by threads of blood tangled in a web she could never escape. Princess Alexia of Greece isn't a household name. She didn't live through grand wars or rule over mighty kingdoms. She wasn't exiled. She wasn't overthrown. Her life unfolded quietly, almost politely, beneath the surface of European royalty's fading glow. And yet, beneath that quiet, her story tells us something important about the long, slow shadow of inbreeding, about how even in the modern age, even as the world marched toward progress, old traditions clung stubbornly to the bloodlines they'd always owned. Alexia was born in 1965 to King Constantine II of Greece and Queen Anne-Marie of Denmark. At first glance, this sounds like any fairy tale royal pairing. A Greek king, a Danish princess, a royal wedding celebrated in newspapers, a daughter born into privilege. But look closer at the family tree, and you'll see how tangled it really is. Her parents weren't just married for love or alliance. They were already connected by blood. Second cousins, third cousins, twice over. Both descended from Queen Victoria of England. Both descended from the royal houses of Denmark and Greece, houses that had intermarried for generations. Theirs wasn't the dramatic inbreeding of ancient Egypt or medieval Spain, but it was inbreeding all the same, subtle, polite, dressed up in pearls and tiaras instead of whispered scandal. And it wasn't just their marriage. Both Constantine and Anne-Marie carried family histories, knotted with cousin marriages. Constantine's grandmother was sister to his great-grandfather. Anne-Marie's great-grandmother was sister to her great-grandfather. Round and round it went, the same handful of noble names, repeating, folding back on themselves like lacework stitched too tightly. The result, children like Alexia, perfectly presentable, perfectly well-behaved, and quietly carrying the long, thin threads of royal bloodlines wrapped too tightly around their lives. Alexia's upbringing wasn't marked by drama. She grew up between palaces and schools, between Greece and Denmark, between ceremony and the ordinary rhythms of privileged life. But beneath the surface, the monarchy she was born into was crumbling. In 1967, a military coup in Greece sent her family into exile. Her father, once king, became just another royal in exile, a title with no throne behind it. So Alexia's childhood became a kind of limbo. A Greek princess without a Greece, a royal child without a royal home. Her family settled in Rome, then London. They attended functions, they appeared in magazines. But the world they represented, the world of dynastic marriages, of carefully tended bloodlines of kingdoms, passed down like heirlooms, was vanishing beneath their feet. Still, tradition dies hard. The royal families of Europe scattered as they were continued to marry among themselves. Titles may have faded, but blood still mattered. When Alexia married in 1999, it wasn't to a fellow royal, but to a Spanish architect. A small rebellion, perhaps. A quiet step away from the expectations that had shaped her ancestors' lives for centuries. Yet even in her choice of husband, the weight of lineage lingered. The marriage was considered somewhat controversial in royal circles, not scandalous but unconventional. A princess marrying a commoner. Not entirely unheard of, but still enough to raise eyebrows behind closed doors. And isn't that the quiet tragedy of Alexia's story? Not dramatic downfall, not public disgrace, but the slow erosion of tradition bumping awkwardly into modern life. A woman born into a system built on blood and hierarchy, trying to live a life where those things no longer held the same power. Her children, born from love rather than alliance, carry those royal genes diluted now by something more ordinary, something freer. They won't rule kingdoms. They won't marry cousins. They'll grow up in a world where their lineage is a curiosity, not a destiny. But the echo remains. The long looping threads of blood still hum beneath the surface, connecting them quietly to centuries of kings and queens who believed wrongly, tragically, that keeping blood pure was worth any sacrifice. So, what do we make of Princess Alexia? She isn't a victim in the same way Isabella or Maria were. She isn't a cautionary tale like Lauren. She lived, she married for love, she had children, and she stepped sideways out of the frame of history. And yet, her life reminds us how slow the world is to change. How even in the 20th century, even among people who vacationed on yachts and flew on private planes, the old ideas lingered. Cousins still married cousins, blood still mattered. And for the women born into that system, the choices were limited. Even rebellion had to be quiet. Even freedom had to be polite. As you breathe slowly now, picture Alexia not in a palace, not draped in royal jewels, but perhaps walking quietly through a park with her children, ordinary in the best possible way, free in a way her ancestors never were, because that in the end is what progress looks like. Not grand revolutions, not crowns shattered on marble floors. Sometimes progress is as simple as a princess marrying a man she loves, raising children who don't have to carry the weight of centuries on their backs. Your breathing is steady now. Your thoughts are softer, lighter. That's good. That's how this is supposed to work. When you're ready, we'll move back in time again to Austria, to the House of Habsburg, to a woman born so deep inside the loops of her family tree that her very existence feels like a grim joke about the price of royal obsession. Maria Antonia of Austria might not be the name you recognize first when you think of the Habsburg dynasty. That's because history prefers to remember the men, the Charleses, the Ferdinands, the Leopolds, or perhaps the tragic Maria Theresa, the empress who tried so hard to hold it all together. But Maria Antonia's life tells a story far more intimate, far more disturbing, and far more revealing about what happens when bloodlines twist in on themselves for too long. If you could look at her family tree, it wouldn't resemble a tree at all. Not something reaching out with branches to the sun. No, Maria Antonia's family tree looks more like a wreath, a tight closed circle wrapped around itself again and again. Uncles marrying nieces, cousins marrying cousins. The same names repeating like a chant in a cathedral. Not for love, but for politics, for land, for control. Maria Antonia was born in 1669 into the Habsburg dynasty, a family already legendary for their obsession with keeping their bloodlines pure, and for the visible cost of that obsession. You've probably heard of the Habsburg jaw, the distinctive jutting chin, the protruding lower lip, the misshapen faces that became more pronounced with each generation. These weren't just unfortunate features. They were the physical manifestations of centuries of inbreeding, and Maria Antonia carried those features with her from birth. A baby born, already marked by her ancestors' choices. But her jaw wasn't the only thing shaped by generations of closed doors. Her health was frail. Her body was weak. And yet, from the moment she could sit upright, expectations were placed on her shoulders. Marry, well, produce an heir, continue the line. What choice did she have? None. That's the pattern, after all. These women didn't choose. They were chosen. Maria Antonia was married off to Elector Maximilian II, Emmanuel of Bavaria, another cousin. Another knot tied tighter in the endless, suffocating web of European royalty. Their union wasn't celebrated for love. It was celebrated because it kept the bloodlines neat, contained, predictable. She bore him children, 3 to be precise, but none of them lived past infancy. A tragedy, yes, but also perhaps inevitable. The human body wasn't designed to withstand this much repetition, this much genetic recycling. Nature pushes back. And in Maria Antonia's case, it pushed back with frailty, with sickness, with loss. Her life wasn't marked by grand scandals or sweeping wars. Instead, it was marked by quiet deterioration of her health, of her marriage, of her purpose. She did what was asked of her. She followed the path laid out by centuries of tradition, and it led her, as it led so many others, to an early grave. She died in 1692, not yet 25 years old, gone before she had the chance to become anything more than a vessel for a dynasty's desperation. Gone before anyone could ask whether she wanted something different. Her death mattered, politically speaking. Her failure to produce a surviving heir helped ignite the War of Spanish Succession. Another war born from royal bloodlines twisted too far. Another generation forced to pay for the mistakes of the ones who came before. But tonight, let's not think about wars. Let's think about her as a person, a young woman, a daughter, a wife, someone who might have loved music or books or quiet gardens had her life allowed room for such things. Someone who perhaps, in moments of solitude, wondered why no one ever asked what she wanted. Maria Antonia's story reminds us that the damage done by inbreeding wasn't just physical. It wasn't just in the weak jaws or the sickly children. It was in the lost possibilities, in the women reduced to functions, in the lives cut short not just by illness, but by the slow erosion of hope. Imagine her, if you will, sitting by a window watching the seasons change. Not a queen in splendor, not a figure in a history book, but a girl wondering what it might feel like to walk somewhere alone, to speak her mind without fear, to laugh without permission. And isn't that in the end what binds all these stories together? Women born into cages they couldn't see until it was far too late. Some of those cages were made of marble and gold. Some of them were built from poverty and silence. But the bars held just the same. Your breathing is softer now, your eyes heavier. That's good. That's how these stories work, not to keep you awake, but to lull you into the gentle acceptance that the past is done, that the ghosts have been heard, and that you can let them rest now. When you're ready, we'll move far back in time, to Egypt, to the tombs, to 2 tiny daughters, born of one of history's most famous incestuous unions. Daughters who never lived to see the sun, whose stories were buried alongside kings and curses. The daughters of Tutankhamun are waiting. The story of Tutankhamun's daughters isn't one of palaces or crowns or royal courts filled with scheming advisors. It's smaller, quieter, sadder. It's a story told in bones and bandages in tiny coffins laid side by side beneath the sands of Egypt. A story that was never meant to be told at all. They don't have names, these daughters. History remembers them only as mummies, 317A and 317B. Numbers, not people. Not girls with futures, with hopes. With mothers who whispered lullabies to swollen bellies. Just designations catalogued by archaeologists in the dry clinical language of science. But behind those numbers, there were once lives brief, fragile lives ended almost before they began. They were born to one of the most famous couples in history, Tutankhamun and his wife, Ankhesenamun. A king and queen, bound not just by marriage, but by blood, brother and sister. or half-brother and half-sister, depending on which scholar you believe. Egyptian royalty had long practiced sibling marriage. They believed it kept the bloodline pure, maintained the divine right to rule. Pharaohs were living gods, after all. Who else but another living god, a sister, a brother, could be a suitable match? To outsiders, it seems grotesque, but within those gilded halls, it was tradition, it was expected, it was sacred, and it came at a cost. A cost paid not by the kings or queens, but by the children born into bodies that could not carry the weight of generations folding in on themselves. Tutankhamun himself was sickly. Modern science tells us this: a clubfoot, a cleft palate, scoliosis, malaria, compromised immune systems. His reign was short, his health fragile. And when he and Ankhesenamun tried to produce heirs, the result was two tiny girls who didn't survive. 317A and 317B were found in his tomb when it was opened in 1922, nestled among treasures meant to carry the young king into the afterlife. Gold and jewels and statues meant to dazzle eternity, and two small coffins barely large enough to hold the tragedy inside. For years, there was speculation. Who were they? Were they truly his daughters? DNA testing finally gave us the answer: yes, they were his. And yes, their mother was close kin. Their bodies bore the marks of genetic frailty, severe congenital deformity, signs of miscarriage, stillbirth. One was born with a severe spinal defect. The other may never have drawn breath at all. There's something unbearably quiet about their story. No portraits remain. No songs were written in their honor. No monuments bear their names. They lived briefly. They died quietly. They were wrapped in linens, laid in coffins, and placed beside a father who wouldn't live to see his 20th birthday. And yet, in their silence, they tell us something profound. They remind us that the obsession with bloodlines, with purity, with keeping power locked inside families, always leaves victims behind. Victims too small to speak for themselves, too brief to leave marks on history beyond a line in a DNA report. Imagine Ankhesenamun, their mother, a girl herself, a queen before she was ready, a sister wife, a daughter of dynasties, trapped in a web spun centuries before her birth, holding her lifeless child, bearing one baby then another, grieving in a palace filled with gods who offered no comfort. Her story is written in absence. After Tutankhamun's death, she disappears from the records. Some believe she was forced to marry again. Some think she was silenced. Whatever her fate, the babies she bore were her legacy. Two daughters lost to tradition, to genetics, to the unrelenting hunger of royal expectation. And what of Tutankhamun, the boy king, so famous now for his golden mask, for the treasures buried with him, for the mystique of his curse? But in life, he was a child ruling a crumbling empire, his body betraying him, his bloodline dooming his children before they could take their first breath. The grandeur of ancient Egypt hides stories like these. Beneath the pyramids, beneath the hieroglyphs, and the myths of eternal life, there are small tragedies. Personal losses, mothers and fathers who wept over tiny bodies wrapped in linen. 316A and 317B remind us that history isn't just made by kings and battles and treaties. It's made in quiet rooms, in grief unspoken, in the weight of generations, pressing down on those too small to carry it. As you rest, now think of them not as mummies in a museum, not as specimens or curiosities, but as what they were meant to be: daughters, children, brief sparks of life snuffed out by forces they couldn't understand. Picture them somewhere beyond time, beyond history, beyond the expectations of gods and kings. Picture them free, whole, running in a sunlit field their parents never knew, laughing in a world where lineage doesn't matter, where their tiny hearts beat strong and sure. Your breathing is slow now, steady. That's good. That's how this works. When you're ready, we'll return to the modern world, to Australia, to a family hidden away from sight, to a woman whose life is a living testament to what happens when isolation and ignorance turn bloodlines inward. Kimberly Colts is waiting. The story of Kimberly Colts isn't ancient. It's not buried beneath pyramids or locked away in the faded portraits of European royalty. Hers is a story from our time, a story you'd think couldn't exist anymore. A story you'd want to believe couldn't happen in the age of science, of knowledge, of progress. And yet it did. Kimberly Colts isn't her real name. It's a pseudonym used to protect her identity, or what's left of it. Because what happened to Kimberly isn't just a tragedy. It's a horror, a living, breathing reminder that the darkest parts of history don't always stay in the past. Sometimes they hide, sometimes they fester, sometimes they pass quietly from one generation to the next until someone finally pulls back the curtain. Kimberly was born into a family isolated deep in rural Australia. A family so closed off, so entwined, so repeatedly folded back onto itself that outsiders barely knew they existed. A family whose secrets were whispered about by neighbors, investigated by authorities, and ultimately revealed in chilling detail by journalists who struggled to find the words for what they saw. The Colts were, in the most literal sense, an inbred family. Not a cousin married here or there, not a distant relation appearing generations later. This was siblings with siblings, parents with children. A loop so tight it left no room for outsiders, no space for escape. By the time authorities uncovered the truth, there were dozens of children. Many bore the marks of generations of incestuous unions, severe intellectual disabilities, physical deformities, behavioral disorders that couldn't be explained away by environment alone. Kimberly was one of them, a child of the system, a product of a family tree that stopped branching generations ago and simply grew inward like a knot. Reports described her appearance with cruel fascination, slurred speech, distorted features, difficulty understanding basic questions. But beneath those descriptions was a simple, awful truth: she never had a chance. This wasn't the ancient world. This wasn't royalty trying to preserve bloodlines. This was poverty, isolation, ignorance, shame, wrapped in silence, passed down like a cursed heirloom. The family lived in filth, in makeshift camps, moving from place to place to avoid detection. Children were born without birth certificates, without medical care, without education. They existed in the shadows, known to almost no one beyond their own twisted circle. When police and social workers finally intervened, the headlines screamed words like House of Horrors, Incest Cult Australia's Dark Secret. Kimberly became the face of it all, not by choice, not by consent, but because the world needed a face to attach to this nightmare. Her image, blurred and anonymized, still made its way across the internet, a symbol of how far humanity can fall when no one is watching. And yet, beneath the headlines, beneath the shock and revulsion, Kimberly was still a person. A woman shaped by circumstances beyond her understanding, beyond her control. A woman whose life began in darkness and never truly stepped into the light. What makes her story different from the princesses we've met before is scale. The royals were playing a game of bloodlines, on a grand stage, their choices justified by politics, by tradition, by a desperate need to keep thrones intact. Kimberly's family had no such excuse. There was no throne, no crown, no empire to protect. Only cycles of abuse, of secrecy, of inherited pain. But the outcome hauntingly familiar. Children born into bodies that couldn't carry them far. Minds stunted by the cruel repetitions of DNA forced into impossible shapes. Lives defined by limits set long before birth. When the authorities tried to unravel how this could happen, in modern Australia no less, they found answers that weren't satisfying. Remote communities, fear of outsiders, generations of people convinced perhaps that they had no other choice. Ignorance passed down like stories around a fire, and through it all, the children, always the children, paying for the sins of those who came before. Kimberly's future is uncertain. The reports trail off after the headlines fade. Some say she lives under care now, away from the family that shaped her. Some say she struggles to adapt, to learn to understand a world that never made space for her. Wherever she is, she carries with her the weight of generations, not as royalty, not as legend, but as a girl who never asked for this. Her story reminds us that bloodlines don't need crowns to twist, that isolation doesn't need palaces to become a prison, that harm done in silence can echo just as loudly as harm done in the halls of kings. As you rest, now let your mind soften around this truth. Not all tragedies are ancient. Some walk beside us still. Some wear ordinary clothes, live in ordinary places, carry names that aren't their own, because the truth behind those names is too heavy to bear. Picture Kimberly not as she was found, not as a headline, not as a victim frozen in someone else's shame. Picture her somewhere quiet, somewhere safe, learning perhaps slowly and gently what it means to choose for herself, to build something new from the ashes of what was broken. Your breathing is slow now, steady. That's good. That's how this works. When you're ready, we'll step back again. To Egypt once more, to a name far more famous than any we've spoken so far. A woman who ruled, who seduced, who has been remembered and misunderstood for centuries. Cleopatra, a queen, yes, but also a woman born into a bloodline just as twisted, just as doomed. Cleopatra. Now there's a name everyone knows. The Queen of Queens, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the woman who captured both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, whose legend outlived her kingdom by thousands of years. A name wrapped in silk and scandal, whispered through history as the embodiment of beauty, seduction, and political cunning. But beneath the gold and the coal-lined eyes, beneath the centuries of myths and the Hollywood romances, Cleopatra was something else too. She was the product of one of the most inbred dynasties the world has ever known. Her family, the Ptolemies, weren't Egyptian by blood. They were Macedonian Greek, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, who took Egypt as his prize when the great conqueror's empire crumbled. From the beginning, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt, not as Egyptians, but as Greek gods wearing pharaoh masks. And like the ancient pharaohs before them, they believed the purity of their blood was sacred, sacred enough to marry brother to sister, again and again and again. Cleopatra was born into this tangled web in 69 BCE. By then, the Ptolemaic family tree wasn't really a tree anymore, more like a braid, looped and twisted and tightened across generations. Brother marrying sister, aunt marrying nephew, cousins tangled with cousins, over and over until names and faces blurred together. Her own parents were likely siblings. Historians still debate the details because the records are patchy, but the odds are high. Her grandparents were also siblings. Her ancestors had been marrying within the family for 300 years. The reasoning was the same, as always. Keep power locked within. Keep outsiders out. Keep the bloodline pure. But purity came at a price. The Ptolemies were infamous for their instability. Madness ran through the family like a shadow. No one could escape. Paranoia, violence, delusions of godhood, generations of rulers who poisoned each other, betrayed each other, killed each other, all while pretending their dynasty stood untouched. Cleopatra's own siblings would prove no different. When her father died, Cleopatra co-ruled with her brother husband Ptolemy XIII. Yes, husband. Yes, brother. Just as the tradition demanded, they fought almost immediately. Power does that to people, but maybe especially to siblings forced into thrones and marriages by accident of birth. Eventually, civil war broke out. Cleopatra fled, gathered her strength, seduced Caesar, and returned with an army. Her brother drowned in the Nile. Another sibling, another husband, Ptolemy XV, took his place beside her on the throne. He didn't last long either. Poisoned, most believe, likely on Cleopatra's orders. She had learned from the best her own family how to secure power when family ties became chains. It's easy to paint Cleopatra as ruthless. It's easy to see her as a temptress, a manipulator, the villainess of Rome's tragedy. But look closer. Look through the smoke and mirrors of history, and what you find is a woman born into a cage she didn't build. A woman raised among ghosts and daggers, where loyalty ended at the edge of ambition. Where her bloodline demanded she marry her brother, bear his children, and smile for the priests who crowned them both divine. She broke free the only way she could by reaching beyond Egypt's borders, by making alliances not with siblings, but with powerful Roman men. First Caesar, then Antony. Not for love, not entirely, but for survival. For the sake of her children, for the hope of an Egypt that might yet escape the suffocation of her family's legacy. But fate had other plans. Rome turned against Antony. Antony turned his sword on himself. Cleopatra followed famously with the bite of an asp, or so the legend says. What matters more is that her death ended not just her life, but her dynasty. Her children were taken. Egypt became a Roman province. The Ptolemaic line twisted and tangled for centuries, unraveled at last. And yet Cleopatra lives on, not in heirs, but in legend, in stories of beauty and brilliance in plays and paintings and films. Her face imagined 1,000 ways. Her voice echoed through time as both satyrine and strategist. But tonight, think of her not as the queen wrapped in gold, not as the seductress draped in silk. Think of her as a woman born into a legacy she didn't ask for. A woman who learned early that survival meant sacrifice, that family could be more dangerous than any enemy. A woman who fought to break free, even if freedom meant dying on her own terms. Cleopatra's story reminds us that bloodlines, no matter how carefully preserved, cannot protect you from ruin. They cannot guarantee happiness or sanity or love. In the end, they only guarantee more blood. As you rest now, imagine her not on a throne, not in a tomb, but on the shores of the Nile as a girl, watching the water flow, wondering if her life might be different. Wondering if her children might someday walk free where she could not. Your breathing is soft now. Your thoughts are gentle. That's good. That's how this works. When you're ready, we'll take one last step together. Not to a palace, not to a battlefield, but to a quiet place of reflection. to think about all these women, their lives, their choices, or the lack of them. To remember them not as victims or villains, but as human beings, as women who lived, who endured, who deserved to be seen. Let's slow down now. Let's take a breath. We've traveled through centuries tonight, from palaces lined with marble to dirt roads wrapped in silence, from ancient Egypt to modern Australia, from the echoes of kings to the whispers of girls no one ever wanted to remember. And what do we find waiting at the end of all these stories? Not royalty, not power, not victory. What we find again and again are women. Women trapped by duty, by blood, by the iron-cold hands of tradition. Women who bore children or didn't. Women who wore crowns or didn't. Women who vanished into history, or into quiet fields, or into unmarked graves. Women who didn't get to choose. That's the thread running through all of this, isn't it, choice? Or the lack of it. Isabella Tseku didn't choose to be born into a family where marriage to a cousin was expected, demanded, required. Mary Louise didn't choose to be sent away from everything she knew to marry a man who would never love her. Lauren Whitaker didn't choose to grow up in isolation, in poverty, in a world where family trees stopped growing outward and began folding inward. Maria, I didn't choose the madness that crept through her bloodline like smoke beneath a door. Mary Louise Elizabeth didn't choose a marriage where her womb was just another battlefield in the War of Dynasties. Princess Alexia didn't choose to carry the quiet weight of bloodlines wrapped too tightly. Maria Antonia didn't choose to die young, her body too fragile to bear the hopes piled onto it. The daughters of Tutankhamun didn't choose to be born at all. Kimberly Colts didn't choose the silence, the shame, the isolation that shaped her. And Cleopatra, for all her fame, for all her power, didn't choose the tangled history that delivered her into a throne beside her brother husband. They were born into cages they didn't build. Some fought, some fled, some endured, some broke. And yet through them all, there is something else, too. Something quieter than tragedy. Something stronger than pity, resilience. Not the kind they wrote about in history books. Not the kind sung by poets or carved into statues. A softer kind. The resilience of surviving, of breathing, of waking up each day in a world that offered them no choices and still choosing to keep going. History forgets women like these. Or worse, it reduces them to footnotes, to cautionary tales, to symptoms of dynasties in decline. But tonight, you haven't forgotten them. You've walked quietly beside them. You've listened to their stories. You've seen the weight they carried and how often it went unseen by the world around them. Maybe that's the lesson in all of this. Not that power corrupts, though it does. Not that bloodlines tangle until they strangle, though they do. But that even in the darkest corners of history, even in the lives written in silence or sorrow, there are people worth remembering, lives worth honoring, women worth seeing. And you lying there now with your eyes growing heavy, you've done something rare. You've given them time. You've given them space. You've let their stories live again, if only for a little while. So rest now. Let go of the past. Let these women fade back into the quiet where they've always belonged. A little less forgotten, a little more understood. Let yourself drift, knowing that history isn't just kings and battles. It's mothers, it's daughters, it's wives, it's girls who were told who to love, who to marry, who to be, and who sometimes found quiet, secret ways to be something else. Breathe in, breathe out. Let your body grow soft against the sheets. Let your mind loosen its grip on the stories we've told. Tomorrow will come, the world will turn, and tonight's ghosts can sleep a little easier knowing they've been seen. You are safe. You are still. The past cannot touch you here. Good night.